Evening.
Good evening. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. How's the weather?
Melting.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh my. Yeah,
Melting.
I've been keeping abreast of everything that's been going on in Chicago and in Texas as well. It's just, oh gosh.
Yeah. Walking and seeing the snow at my waist is not an easy thing to visualize.
My gosh, at the waist. Wow.
It is.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, I have memories of that.
Yeah, we don't get it often, but when we do, we make up for it.
It's memorable, as
Yes,
it's
it is. It's
yeah.
beautiful to look at, and that's about it.
From your living room, as you can
Oh,
see
yeah.
out.
Yep.
But if the heat's working or the fireplace is working, so on and so forth, and then
Yep.
you have food and you have electricity and all those
And you're
things,
doing
but
fine. Yep.
and you're doing fine. Yeah, yeah. And
And it,
and you have the health, right? That's another thing. You
yes, it
have the
is.
health because winter is brutal. I mean,
Yeah, winter has its moments.
winter has its moments. I mean, so does the heat. But
Yeah.
I hear from people that it's not the same. You
No,
know,
it's not.
it's not the same. I mean, you have heat, you get an AC, and you don't necessarily have to step out, right?
Right.
But the biting winter is
Yeah, winter has a way of getting
of
your
letting you
attention.
know who's in charge.
Yes, it gets your attention for sure.
Yeah, indeed. Gosh,
Oh yeah.
well,
Good
hope
evening.
ever. Hey, how are you, Vernon? How's it going?
Absolutely wonderful.
Good, man. Good, good. Happy to
I'm in
see
a
you.
cave. I'm in a cave.
You're in the Bat Cave. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not in the back cave.
You're not in the Bat Cave. Oh my
I'm in a
gosh.
man.
In the
I'm
Man
in a
Cave.
man.
In the Man Cave. Yeah, I always thought that the Bat Cave was a pretty cool man cave, but I hear you. Um, so yeah, we're going to commence. I am under the impression that at some point in time, um, Minnie will excuse me, Minnie will join us. But I want to make sure that we have a lot to cover today, and I want to be able to take advantage of the time to do that. So I'd like to begin by doing a type of review and some additional um, ideas. I have some comments to share with all of you about what are some of the key philosophical principles that we've discussed. And I do that for two reasons: because we've had two major holidays, and also because it's relatively new material. Hey, Porter, and so
Hey,
um,
Joseph.
how are you, sir? So I
How
want to
are you?
go ahead. Good, good, good. I want to go ahead and you know provide and offer that opportunity for us to talk and to just make sure that everybody is able to either take a photograph or write down this information. I'm going to share it on the share screen. And then after that, I want to go ahead and also cover what are some of the basic, what we refer to as currents, right? That are pretty much channeled throughout the tradition of Western, what's called moral philosophy. And then after that, I'd like to go ahead and bring your attention to one of those key syllabus goals or ends, which is, and I'm going to show you an example of how you can generate your own ethical criteria. I bring that to your attention this evening for two reasons. First of all, because I've mentioned to you at the beginning of the course of how important it is for us to be theologizing in our local parish, but also because I believe that it's important for us to do that work ourselves. And especially with something like moral philosophy or Christian ethics, that obviously is not just so that it can be headspace and we can just kind of entertain those ideas at our leisure, academic leisure, but that we go from the thought, or we go from the head to actual practice, right? And so remember, I mentioned that we have the theory and then we have praxis. And so I think this example, which I found recently in a blog, I think is something that we can all benefit from. And so I'm going to give you that. And then we're going to have an assignment based on that, that will help you to start putting some of these concepts together. Lastly, I want to go ahead and give you some themes from Howard Thurman's very important book, which is The Search for Common Ground, which in essence, this book, The Search for Common Ground, is one of Howard Thurman's most important books. And it's a relatively short read, but it's a very deep read. And Howard Thurman's whole principle behind this is really, one of ethics, which is how do we provide, how do we afford, and how do we secure an opportunity for diversity and for all voices to be able to be in community. When he refers to this idea of the beloved community, which is later on something that resonates deeply and intimately with Dr. King, but the real idea here is that whether it's a beloved community under struggle or a beloved community that is able to enjoy freedom, it doesn't stop from there being conflict. It may be that conflict is at various or very different measures or degrees. This is true, but human beings are human beings. And so really this notion of the search for common ground, again, begins with an internal one. And then there are some just key principles that we'll go into next week talking about. And if we have time, I'd like to share with you some ideas of some 20th century ethicists of the Christian tradition that will then give us all of the necessary background that we'll need, not only for the assignment, but also for what we'll eventually do as a class later on in the course. So without further introduction, let's go ahead and begin. So I'd like to first introduce you to this very first concept that we're going to be looking at this evening. And it's one that, again, I'm going to share it with you. But it's I think it's a very important tool. And so here we go. Now share screen, and here we go. So hi Minnie, how are you? Welcome as well. So this is the first recap that I want to do with all of you this evening, and it's the early roots of the Western moral tradition. I selected this site because it's excellent. It's very simple to follow. Some of these philosophical websites, are just a nightmare unnecessarily. I like this one because it covers everything that really serves as the foundation for all Christian ethics from the beginning of the church to the present. At the end of the day, it's really just kind of going through what some of these early philosophers talked about. And so that's really why I think it's going to be the most edifying material and the most necessary material for you to keep in mind. Why? Because really, it's in the first century that, as all of you know, the New Testament is put together. And it's the New Testament that is directly and it's sometimes indirectly inspired by all of these philosophical constructs of moral philosophy. So the very first thing that I want to bring to your attention is that the primary question, and I even put that on the syllabus, but I want to do this again, the primary question of ethics, and certainly this is true for Christian ethics, is how shall I live? So it's a question that is predicated on two understandings. The first is that I exist. The second one is that I am a being. So that I am an existential being on this planet with conscience and with a question, a reflection. So therefore, it's an exercise in reason. How shall I live? And all that really comes out of that is an attempt to ask that question and to then afford some very important perspectives and insights on how that's going to happen. Now, one of the key themes early in the Western Greek tradition is this notion, and you see that word there. Let me extend it out just so you see it. And it's this notion of eudaimonia, 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 which means happiness. And so this idea is that the overarching end, and remember we talked about instrumental ends and intrinsic ends before, the end above all ends in the Greek mindset is happiness, which is interesting because if you notice that we also find life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is not a coincidence. It's not as if they just happened to pull the words out of the hat, or the founding fathers and mothers had fortune cookies, or, it just happened to be one of those aspects of synchronicity. This was intentional, that the overarching end of human existence is happiness. And so you can make an argument that any time that we fall short of happiness, we are in essence falling short of fulfilling the mandate above all mandates according to Western philosophy from the ethical perspective. Now, I should add this as well here. In Christianity, there is a sense also of happiness. In Christianity, it's referred to as joy, right? And notice how often Jesus says, so that our joy is made complete, right? That you and I are one as my Father and I are one, so that our joy is complete. And so there is this expectation as well in the Christian narrative that joy, that joy is going to be what one will experience. Now, the text also refers to this idea of shalom, or peace, which, if you recall from our Judaism course, does not mean just peace between nations, but it means a sense of healing, a sense of fulfilling, a sense of knowing one's purpose and place. This is obviously something that's going to what? Make us feel happy, right? So in a very objective way, it seems that the Christian tradition and Western philosophical heritage, the patrimony that we have from that heritage, the Western philosophical one, is really meeting the same ends, which is that God has put us on this planet. And I say God, talking about the Greeks, because Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and all of the philosophical tradition, really up to the time that we get to Descartes, is not questioning whether or not God exists. That's going to come later. So whether they call him the unmoved mover, or the first cause, or a great intelligence or wisdom, or Sophia, whatever the case may be, there is this understanding that God has created this world, and at the end of the day, it is the intention of human existence to facilitate or to provide the contexts whereby we're able to be happy. All right. So that's a very important thing. Now, there is no question that happiness is a subjective experience, which is also very important, which then this brings in the component of what? Of diversity. And so this is kind of the first idea that we're going to experience here indirectly with Howard Thurman, because if happiness is a subjective experience, which we want to guarantee that all people are able to enjoy, then it is about not being overbearing, or demanding, or expecting, or teaching, or saying this is the only way that you can be happy, but rather to provide the context where people can enjoy whatever happiness means to them. Now, I want to say that with this caveat, keep in mind that we can't assume that that is true of somebody who is taking heroin. Okay, so we're not talking about someone who's an addict. We're not talking about someone who has an illness, or someone that is dealing with paranoia, or someone that is dealing with identity um, matters. We're talking about people who have the use of reason, who are of sound mind, and who come from different and diverse cultural, religious experiences, of which all of them, through their own enjoyment, their own sense of identity, their own sense of who they are, the things they want to pursue, the aspirations and the dreams they may have, all of these things are going to influence in one way or another their understanding of happiness. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we understand and we're sensitive to that. Right, so the next thing that you'll notice is that it says here, right, that in order for us to be able to live, in order for us to be able to enjoy happiness, notice that it says up here, right? Therefore, what constitutes the good life, right? And so, what do we mean when we talk about the good life? So, here there's another definer, right? Which is happiness comes to those who live a good life. So, what does that mean? In the Western philosophical tradition, and certainly Christianity talks about this as well, is that although all human beings are created, okay, for the purposes of enjoying this life and experiencing happiness, that it requires the living out of a good life in order for happiness to be procured. I want to say three things about that. Number one, I said that we are created because although biology is you know, biology is in the work of producing, we call reproduction. We are reproduced, if you will, the society, the race, the human species is reproduced by biological parents. The idea there is that it is through that biological mechanism of reproduction that humanity continues to be multiplied. But at the end of the day, it is a creative process. Why? Because all that humanity can do is reproduce what has already been put into action through a universal cause. Okay, that's why I say created and not reproduced, because we reproduce each other, obviously, next generation, next generation, next generation. But if you go back to the very, very beginning of the philosophical tradition, and of course of Christianity, and of course Judaism, and of course Islam, you could even mention that is true in Hinduism, although Buddhism doesn't entertain that. Zoroastrianism does, obviously, Yoruba traditions do, is that we are created. Okay, so that means that we are created by an intelligent designer, an intelligent being, the unmoved mover, the first cause, God, whoever you want to refer to this intelligent authority as. And that intelligent authority does not require or doesn't need another prior cause for it to be. This is important. So if you start asking, okay, so who brought by or who brought up or who created this intelligent authority or this intelligent agency, there would be consensus among this early generation of Western thinkers that the unmoved mover, the first cause, the intelligent designer, what have you, is pure, unadulterated necessity, permanent necessity that is independent of any prior cause. So is full actuality, never potentiality. Everybody understands that. This is the character then of what we're talking about. Now, having said that, that means that this intelligent designer agency has given us, therefore, intrinsically meaning, significance, and purpose. Okay? So if we possess meaning, if we possess significance, and we possess purpose, then it is obvious that there is a goal that if we meet, if we come to terms of what we mean, if we give ourselves the value we deserve, and we live our purpose out, that we are therefore living what? The good life. And so the ramifications are going to be what? Happiness. So you can see the role of not just the church or of religion, but also of the state, right? To be able to guarantee that all human beings have this experience. Any questions up to now? None? Okay, cool. So let's move on then. So one of the things
I got
that,
a question. I'm trying not to say nothing, but I just want to be clear. What you're stating now is the baseline and the foundation of your lecture tonight, and not the total general philosophy that is accepted by humanity or by us, period. You're just restating and stating exactly from what basis you're building on right now. Am I correct?
Vernon, I'm not sure I understand the question. I apologize.
Okay, the question. Okay, let me go back to a statement that you made, where everything must be based on the fact that there's nothing exists prior to primal cause.
Well, in the
Is that
Christian
what you said?
tradition, correct.
Yes.
Right. In Christianity, right, exactly.
Okay. You're
Mhm.
building off of that then. Okay, I'm good at that then.
Yeah. Well, I
I'm good
mean,
with that.
the I have to present that because remember that it's a course on Christian ethics.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
I'm good.
So
I'm good.
in order for us to be able to say, okay, this is the reason why I act this way. So I'm glad you bring up that comment because it's a conversation that I've had with students at FIU, Florida International University, at the high school. I've had it at the church, and it's this. And so I'm very grateful you bring up the question. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? I've also had people ask me, so what ethics or how do I know something is right or something is wrong, right? So how do I subscribe or how do I do or what do I follow? What do I obey? There's 101,000 ways to ask the question, but fundamentally speaking, the issue that I'm extracting from all of those questions, and I've been told that I'm right, is that the reason that compels me, right, or the rationale that instills in me a sense of I should live this way is because there is, in this case, in the Christian story, there is a God, right, who has, in essence, created us. And so there's a relationship there, whether we like it or not, right? I mean, there is a relationship there. It's like we have biological parents, whether we speak to them or not, whether we have a relationship with them or not, whether they're with us or they're now dearly departed, they're our parents. And while we're alive on this world, on this planet, in this world, in this realm of matter, we have a variety of circumstances which sometimes gives us the power to choose or to not choose to have a relationship with them. And then we also have to ask ourselves, what's the value of that relationship? And then we're also invited to ask ourselves, do we want to proceed in that relationship? Do we want to improve, deepen it? Is it significant to us? If it doesn't mean anything to us, has it hurt us? Has it edified us? So there's all these questions that we ask, but they're all really nothing more than an extension, a deep, personal, subjective extension of a reality, which is what? That there is an existing relationship, that we came out of them. Does that make sense? So in the Christian narrative, the same thing
Yeah.
happens. In the Christian narrative, in a course like this one, the idea is I'm going to act this way because I am convinced that there is a God and that God doesn't have another authority, which is very important. Because if that God had another authority, or if that God had another source, then in essence, I really wouldn't be able to fully say, well, this is the God that I'm going to obey, because that means that there's another power above it. And so that other power above that God can, in some way or another, be the more legitimate authority, or for that matter, be the one that in essence is the one that I should be looking for, right?
And that was the basis of my question.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
so
I mean,
right. So in the Christian tradition, the idea is there is one God, and this one God is not created, which is why that God is permanent, full, pure actuality. That God is never potentiality. Because if that God was potentiality, then that means that that God would be at the mercy of a prior cause to dictate whether or not that God comes into being. And so, because that God is in permanent being, permanent existence, full necessity, never possibility, always present, doesn't require a prior cause, then now philosophically we have met the criteria for what we say is the full, unadulterated, rational, reasonable, intelligent author of all action. And so now we know that the moral compass, the moral code that is underneath, over, around, and within the Christian story doesn't come from you, doesn't come from me. It comes from God. So that's the idea.
okay, right. You know, as long as it's in that context, and I understand that you do, and that was my original question:
Hmm.
was this within a contextual framework,
Yeah.
or was it just general? You made it perfectly
Oh,
clear. Thank you.
yeah. No, it has to be within the context of the course. Sure. I can't share with you guys what I just think out of the blue, because it wouldn't be academic, nor would it be responsible. Um, so now what we're going to do is we're going to leave just these general perspectives. And now we're going to go ahead and say, okay, so who were some of the early thinkers that, emphasized these principles for us? And of course, the most famous of all is Socrates, right? And so Socrates, as a quick review, told us that the key to all happiness and the key to ensure that we are able to live the good life begins with knowledge. The more knowledge we possess, the more knowledge we're able to, acquire, helps us to confirm three things. Number one, that the more that I know, the less I really do. And of course, that what helps me to avoid sin, which in Socrates' view was ignorance, was what? The accumulation of knowledge. And thirdly, most importantly, the more that I accumulate knowledge, because I know that I don't know everything, it is therefore challenging me to give birth to new ideas, more rational, well understood ideas, so that I'm in a constant process philosophically of giving birth to new ideas, challenging the ones that are inconsistent. And that is going to help me, right, to, as I acquire more knowledge, I'll be able to live a more virtuous life, and I'll be able to make more rational, wise choices. And as I live according to that, I begin to live correctly. And as I live correctly, I live virtuously. And as I live virtuously, I live the good life. And so therefore the outcome of that would be what? Happiness. Okay. So again, from an ethical perspective, then from the Christian story, this is the reason why Christian education plays a role. Um, we could be very critical of it, and heaven knows I am, but we're speaking now theoretically. This is a reason why Christian education is supposed to exist, so that this component of knowledge, of biblical principles, of doing theology in the context of the local church, of building and uplifting the congregations, and having a clerical, a cadre of clergy that have attended seminary, that have studied, that have been going through a process of preparation and of introspection and of prayer, are then able to what? To lead the congregation. So one of the first things that is expected of a spiritual leader, a religious leader in the Christian story, that is what? A person who is an educator, a teacher, right? And this is one of the reasons why Jesus was often referred to as what? Rabbi, right? Which means at the time of Jesus, not priest, it means what? Teacher, right? So this is the reason why Jesus was constantly giving parables and constantly speaking to the disciples, and he would always do two things. He would give a teaching, and then he would what? Heal. Theory, praxis. Theory, praxis. Theory, praxis. So he would teach, he would do a parable, he would turn around, and then he would tell the disciples da 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 da, or somebody would ask him, Master, what about this? And he would say da 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 da, or he would go and he would ask somebody, what do you need from me? And they would say, I need you to heal me. He would heal them, and then they would say, oh, blasphemy, da da, and then he would turn around and he would do what? He would teach them. Sometimes with great what? Bravado, and sometimes in a pretty cavalier way. But it was always what? A teaching that was in union with what? Praxis, action, right? And so that's the important thing. The knowledge has to come to a place that I can then begin to what? Show it, right? Cool. The next one, of course, is Plato. And Plato takes this idea of knowledge is key from Socrates, but he says something which I think is very important, which again is an element that is eventually going to again play a huge role in this idea by Howard Thurman. And it's this, that justice, right? Justice, which you're thinking, wait a minute, but Daniel, we were just talking about happiness. Absolutely. If you really look at the idea behind life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if you really look at what that means, the only way that you can ensure that everyone in this country has life, liberty, or happiness, that life, liberty, and, excuse me, the pursuit of happiness, is if you have a just society where everyone is afforded with the opportunity of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So without justice, right? Without justice, you don't have happiness. But what's interesting about that is that Plato says, before we can ever imagine, ever conceive of this justice being universal in any state, he calls his the republic, or if we could ever imagine of a society that guarantees this for all people, it has to begin with the internal harmony, and that's just. So this is incredible because Plato is saying that your healing is in essence an exercise of justice. Because if you're not healed, you're actually being unjust to yourself. And if you're being unjust to yourself, then you're never going to be able to be happy. Oh my. So it's an issue with your own sense of personal judgment and justice before you can ever be happy. And then, of course, hopefully that will multiply. Now, this is a reason why in the Christian story, you have this idea of you having to first what? Be transformed within. This is the whole premise behind Jesus telling Nicodemus that you have to be born again, right? In spirit, right? Because if that harmony doesn't first happen within, if you are not first experiencing shalom, if you're not first experiencing the Shabbat, right, within you, and you're not laying down in green pastures, right, then don't even imagine that other people around you are going to be able to do the same. And this goes back to that principle in the social gospel where the 19th, early 20th century social gospelers in the United States were saying, if we want a just society where the kingdom of God is realized on earth as it is in heaven, we have to first teach the people in the institutions to love so that those institutions can eventually love. Because if the institution doesn't love, it's not the school, it's not the library, it's not the government office, it's not City Hall. The building is immoral. It's completely amoral. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a building. It's the people who are inside who are going to be making either just or unjust decisions. And in a way, those just and unjust decisions are ultimately going to be what? A reflection of what is inside of each and every one of us. Okay, so that is why in the Christian story, all of that is defined as what? Having the mind of Christ, having the heart of God. Because if you have the mind of Christ and the heart of God, you're going to be able to what? You're going to have the harmony and the peace within you that you are then going to be able to be what? God for someone else, the Christ for someone else. And that Christic consciousness is going to be what? Multiplied and flow like energy all around, right? So justice is harmony, according to Plato, between three different parts of the soul. And if you recall from last time, this is called the tripartite soul. And the tripartite soul in the Platonic literature is that, as I had mentioned before, reason descends from the world of forms. Reason descends from a place that is inhabited by the demiurge. Remember, note, there's a lot of different interpretations to what or who the demiurge is. And as it descends, it is therefore connected to the emotional part of the person, which is sometimes originally translated as the spirit, and then the appetites, right, which are often the desires or the passions. And so, if there is harmony, reason rules. Okay, it doesn't cancel out emotion. It doesn't cancel out desire, but it balances it so that the passions that are exercised are well within reason. The emotions expressed are intelligent, is where we get emotional intelligence eventually from. And so with the reason that we really, in other words, if reason rules, then the real self is ruling. That's another interesting thing, right? Because we actually descend. Reason is who we really are. And so the more that reason is balancing and being the leader of this harmony, the more that the true self is actually operating in this plane of existence as when we are really at home, which is what? The world of forms. Why is that? Because remember that Plato said that everything that we do here, okay, that there is the perfect copy up there in the world of forms. So when we descend and we are trying to find that balance between emotion and appetite with reason, the more that we successfully have reason balancing everything, the more that we are approximating the perfection that is in the world of forms. Okay? That's the connection between this world and the world of forms. It's very interesting. Do on earth as it is in heaven. Whatever you bound here is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose here is loosened in heaven. So the idea there is the same. It's the concept that if we begin to live more and more and more accordance to the God within us, more to how we have been created in the image of God, thinking more like Christ, having more the heart of God, then we will begin to act more and more and more like what? Our true self. Parentheses. Why? Because if you look at the Christian tradition, scripture teaches us that we exist prior to being what? Reproduced. Scripture says that God knows us before we're in our mother's womb. So that means who we really are is already in the presence of God. So as we come through our parents into this world of teaching and of lessons and of learning, which is not arbitrary or coincidental, there is purpose, there is meaning for why we're here, then obviously the more that we go back into the right relationship with God, the more that we then go back to the relationship that pre-exists what? Having skin, having body, having matter, right? So that's the reason where we can find that balance. And of course, the more that we find that balance, what's important then is the more that we begin to demonstrate, illustrate to the people all around us, what exactly does it mean to live what? The kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And now, of course, notice it says in the second bullet there, being just is in our own self-interest. You might think, that's pretty egotistical. Well, the idea there is, of course, very similar to what you find in Jeremiah. One of the things that God tells Jeremiah is, pray for the city, because if it goes well for the city, it's going to go well for you, right? So the idea is that it isn't self-interest as in egotistical. It's in self-interest that we often have this mindset, right, of scarcity. But if you look at this idea of self-interest, not as scarcity, but by the perspective of, if I do right all that is right, if I do all that is within my power to do through empathy, compassion, gratitude, thanksgiving, so on and so forth, I am going to have that reciprocated. Okay? If you plant a tomato seed, you're not going to get oranges. Right? If you plant a tomato seed, you're going to get tomatoes. So if you plant love, you're going to get it. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be weeds. That doesn't mean that there are not going to be all sorts of blights and problems and heat waves, so on and so forth, and frosts. Of course, you got to go through that. But at the end of the day, if that seed is nurtured and cared for and provided, and one remains attentive to what one plants and harvests, you're going to get tomatoes. Right? One thing that I learned when I started cultivating tomatoes is that you never pour water over the plant. Tomatoes are very finicky that way. So you always want to pour water only on the roots. They just don't like water on their leaves. At the moment you learn that, plus a few little tricks, guess what? You're done going to the supermarket to buy tomatoes. So even though I was pouring water initially, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? But I was not aware of what the tomato plant needed. I was doing it just the way that I thought I would like it, like when I shower. So the more that I begin to understand how it's in my self-interest to really know what that tomato plant needs. Because if it's healthy, I'm healthy. If it blossoms, I eat. If it gives me something for me to harvest, it's healthy, it's enjoyable, it remains in my community, and I remain with it. Right? So that's what Plato meant by self-interest, right? Very, very important. And it's not to be confused with the moral relativism that sometimes happens. Now, that's important, though. We need to talk about that. And if you notice here, it says here that the views that Socrates and Plato had are in direct opposition to the moral relativism of the sophists. I got to say something about that. The idea that the sophists had is that the sophists loved to argue. They loved it. Socrates couldn't stand them because they loved to argue for argument's sake. And what Socrates found very disingenuous about them is that they didn't argue so that you would arrive at an end. They argued just to teach the younger people to argue and to argue and to argue and to argue, but not even really know why they're arguing. And my gosh, doesn't that sound like today? People are constantly arguing, constantly debating, but it doesn't seem like the real issues ever get discussed. It doesn't seem like the real things that need to change are changed. It doesn't seem like there's real transformation. This is the reason why Socrates and Plato just couldn't stand these guys. Because what they said was the following. The reason why the sophists were successful, and I'm going to say something that's probably very controversial, but in Christianity, this is how it works. If everybody has their own moral code, and everyone says, well, it's true for me, it's not true for you, it's good for me, it's not good for you, this is the way that I think it's right, it doesn't matter what you think, this is my truth, that's your truth, then there's a fragmentation. There's a fragmentation of a sense of an authority or of a truth that is overseeing the overall collective purpose, meaning, and ends of this planet, right? So this is where there's an issue between authority based on absolute truth and relative truth. Absolute truth means that there are things that are true whether we want to accept them or not. Let me give you an example. Gravity. Gravity is absolutely true. So whether we recognize it, whether we're even aware, like most of us, when we go into our houses and we drop our bags or we put down our keys, that's gravity functioning. But we're not thinking about it that way. We're like, okay, I put the keys here. I put the groceries over there. I'm going to now sit and watch something on TV and just chill, right? But every single exercise that I've done, the fact that the house is where it is, the fact that I can put my keys where I put them, the fact that I can put the groceries where I did in the refrigerator, and then I'm able to sit and enjoy something on the telly, All of that is made possible by something I'm not even paying any attention to at that moment, which, by the way, I'm probably taking for granted. It's called gravity. So gravity is true whether I accept it or not. And so what a lot of early Christian theorists and theologians and philosophers were saying is that God's existence is true whether we accept it or not. And if God's existence is true, whether we accept it or not, then the moral agency of that intelligent designer is true, whether we accept it or not. Now, what ends up being distorted is not the authority of the actuality of the existence of God. What gets distorted are the interests that are subjective and are relative to what? To a distorted view of self-interest. Because the distorted view of self-interest is that I want to get what I want to get before you get yours. Because it's no longer self-interest rooted on the premise of abundance for everyone. It's now a distorted view of self-interest rooted on the illogical and false belief of scarcity, which means there's not enough to go around, so I got to get mine before you get yours. And yet, every single day, we see all of the world around us that there is more than enough to go around. But we create the false narrative that we all buy into, regardless of the political and economic structures. They're all guilty of this, that there isn't enough to go around. So self-interest, rather than being, it's in my interest that you're happy, it's in my interest that you're well, it's in my interest that you're able to find and live a joyful and just life, that is now distorted because it's no longer self-interest with knowledge, it's now looking at self-interest ignorantly. So we go back to the idea that self-interest, which can actually be a very positive thing, is also distorted, creating an unjust world, creating the lack of harmony, the cacophony and the chaos, which produces the inability for any system and for the church itself to provide what? The guarantee for everyone to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you see how that works, how that distortion can work. So I'm not saying that if you like vanilla and I like strawberry, that one is right or wrong. But what I am saying is that we need to be very careful when we look at moral relativism, because most of us, when we look at moral relativism, we're not really looking at the subjectivity of how I interpret truth. I am looking more at preference. And preference is not a moral decision. Preference just means I like it because it tastes good. I like it because I have pleasure. And so it becomes a utilitarian perspective. And we'll talk more about that soon. The next idea that I want to bring to your attention is that of Aristotle. And Aristotle, as I had mentioned to you before, took on a very, how can we say, took on a very practical approach to ethics and to philosophy at large. And so he does say that the purpose of human life is happiness, and that the purpose of happiness is that one, of course, in order to achieve it, must be virtuous, but also that ethics really is it's not an exact science. It's really something that requires a moderate view of life. Temperance. There needs to be moderation. We cannot go to extremes, and we have to look at things at a case by case way and realize that, this whole thing about black and white doesn't really per se exist. We need to be very careful about that. So Aristotle is very practical, whereas Plato tends to be more otherworldly, more exact, more abstract and ethereal. Aristotle tends to be more on the ground, more practical, again, more reasonable, and also welcoming the discomfort and the challenges that come with living on this planet. One of the things that he does say is that there has to be something called the golden mean, and I think that's where we were leaving off last time. Aristotle is willing to say that everything has a purpose. We all have a purpose. He guarantees that we all have a purpose. And we are living a good life and we're doing something good when we are realizing that for which we were created. He gives the example, and other scholars have used the example of a hammer. If you use a hammer for the purposes that the hammer was produced, that is to say, driving in nails, pulling them out, then we would say that the hammer is being used for the purposes for which it was produced. If we used a hammer to hammer someone's head in, obviously it's not that the hammer is bad or good, but the hammer is not being used for the purposes for which it was produced. So therefore, it's being used for a bad deed. But everything has the potential to be good, which is important, because I'd like to take this Aristotelian idea and challenge the thinker, challenge you who's listening, to ask yourselves, to what extent can this be similar to the idea of we're born sinful? I'd like to think that, and this is true of early Christianity, we're not born sinful, we're not born good. We're born with the potential for good and for evil, right? So we're born with the potential for doing good things. All of us, we're born with the potential of very, very good things. But we're also born with the potential to be disobedient. We're also born with the potential to do bad things. So one of the guarantees, or one of the safeties that we kind of see philosophy provides for us, is that the more that we are aware of what our purpose is, and the more that we are trained and raised up and edified and built and supported and encouraged, right, to do that for which we were created, then the higher the probability that we're going to be what? Living a good life, because we're going to be doing that for which we were created. So now it makes total sense how so many people may not feel that their lives are meaningful. Why? It makes sense, because they're not feeling somewhere in the very existential core of who they are that they're doing anything for which they were created. You see? Many of us do jobs, but that doesn't mean that we're doing that for which we were created. And many of us do all sorts of things to try to what? To survive. But that doesn't mean that we're doing something that fulfills. The greatest criticism that was found in capitalism, and I'm not saying this because I'm anti-capitalist or anything, I'm just not about that, but it makes sense, and we should think about that, is that Marx talked about alienation. He wasn't the only one, so did Hegel. And what they both said is that when the human being is divorced from doing that for which what they were created to do, that they begin to feel a sense of poverty. They begin to feel a sense of estrangement from themselves and eventually from others. I'll give you an example. If you're a carpenter, and people would always go to you so that you would be able to provide them with a artistic and functional piece of furniture, which was what? A bed. That was the only bed. No one made beds like that artisan. That's what they did. That's what their devotion was. They worked with their hands. They did incredible quality work with wood. But at the moment that a factory comes and the factory says, we don't need that carpenter anymore, now we can make a bed for so much cheaper, right? With cheaper materials, but a bed that is now well within the affordability of all. Well, guess what? Now it's no longer artistic, it's functional. I get you to get a bed that I convince you shouldn't have to pay for that, because, at the end, this is cheaper, this is better for you, keep your money, this or that. And then I can produce what would take that carpenter perhaps X amount of months to produce that one wonderful piece of furniture, which is now a family heirloom, is passed on generation to generation. Now you can go out there and probably for half of that, if not for slightly even more, buy a bed that you can take home today, build it, and sleep on it tonight. Oh, and by the way, I can have the machines to do that. And so that I have less overhead of having to pay people or insurance, liability, workman's comp, da 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 da. And guess what? Most of those profits come to me. But that person who's a carpenter can no longer work as a carpenter to survive. They may have to go out there and find another job or something else so they can now what? Survive. So the carpentry was not just a means of survival, because that was their livelihood, but it was the reason and the why they did what they did. It was an artistic expression. They worked with wood. They identified with what they were doing. They felt fulfilled. Now they're no longer fulfilled. You see? So are there criticisms for and against? Of course there are. But my intention here is for you to see how important it is to realize that there is something about human flourishing. There is something to be said about that. And of course, in the Christian tradition, it's the exact same thing. that if I am doing that for which if I'm doing that for which was the purpose of my creation, I was created to do this work. I was created to do this while I'm here on earth. And I'm able to really activate and understand what that purpose for my creation is all about, that I have a much better sense of existence, right? I have a much better sense of appreciating the value, the pricelessness in me, my significance as a person. Oh, and by the way, my sense of purpose. This automatically elevates what? My overall understanding of self, of others, of this world, and of course of the one who created me. And that comes by understanding things like you're loved, you're healed. There's so much in the Christian literature that invokes in us that our purpose, and of course in a very, very profound theological way, the Christian tradition teaches that the ultimate end for our creation is what? The worship of God. And if at the end of the day, the ultimate purpose for our creation is the worship of God, then you can see that everything that we do then is what? An act of worship. And if everything that we do is an act of worship, then everything is in essence what? A sacrament. Because everything that we do is an opportunity for God to transmit to us and us to others what? Grace. And grace is life affirming. Grace is life transforming. Grace is in the end an expression of Almighty God. And so you can see how you can take whether you're a carpenter, an astronaut, a small business owner, a politician, a teacher, or a homemaker. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, everything that is done is what? Now seen through the perspective that everything that we do on earth as it is in heaven is what? Holy. And that means that it's been set apart for the ultimate worship of who? Of God. And so it diminishes idolatry and it increases what? The right relationship once again for God, because now I understand why I was created. Okay, let's go to the next idea here. And really quickly, just so we look at some of these quick views before we now go to the next slide. And we're doing pretty good on time. I'm really glad that we're able to cover all of this, because again, all of you can write this down, take photographs of it, have it available to you, right? So in the Hellenistic period, which really is the period that is going to lead us into the first century and after, we have these four particular schools that are still with us in some way. The first one is the school of the Cynics, right? And this is the purpose of life is happiness through virtue in accordance with nature. And the idea that why they're called, the Cynics is that they look at reason as being in accordance with nature. They don't look at it as something that is, well, reason exists for the purposes of managing social norm or social constructs. So we have to be aware of that their idea of nature and of human purpose is that we return to nature. So I don't want to take this to the ultimate extreme in light of having talked about Aristotle, but you can be cynical when you are assuming that everything, right, philosophically or in the world of knowledge has to have an instrumental end, right? Or that everything has to have an angle, or that everything has to have an agenda, or that everything has to have a purpose in that sense. No. The real sense of who we are is a return to what we come from, which is what? Not an inauthentic, disingenuous, apersonal or impersonal rat race of a society, but rather a very intimate engagement with who we are as people, and understanding that that relationship exists in a union with nature. The next are the skeptics, and the skeptics, this is easier in the sense that they doubt that there can be any moral certainty, because they believe that moral certainties by their own merit or definition get in the way of one's ability to really know, because you really cannot know. And so skeptics begin by overstating the fact that this idea of really knowing is very hard to ever achieve, if at all. So a more extreme skeptic would be a nihilist, where they totally deny they totally deny truth. They do not believe truth is ever possible. In fact, it's not even real. So because there's no moral certainties, because there's no real way to rationally achieve that certitude, then guess what? You're pretty much the author of your own moral compass, your own moral code. And of course, Jean-Paul Sartre after the Second World War becomes very popular because Sartre, as I had mentioned to you before, speaks of the autonomy or the self-law of the person. You are your own agency, because in the lack of moral certainty and in the lack of being able to really know, because truth is practically impossible to ever attain, that is therefore a license to be free, to then do what? To create our own moral code, and then to be fully responsible for how we execute it, how we illustrate it, how we hold ourselves accountable to it. Okay. The next one are the Epicureans. And the Epicureans, you're going to notice, have a very interesting relationship with the utilitarians. You could say that in many ways they're the precursors. And what they say is that what's good is pleasurable and what is bad is painful, period. So, how do you attain happiness? Through pleasure. So to them, the moral questions such as promiscuity, or the moral questions such as partying, or the moral questions such as, you know, um, well, it was pleasurable, but you have vows, or it's pleasurable, but you have expectation. No, those are constructs that society puts in as ways of what? Ironically, of limiting one's ability to attain happiness. So, in essence, when there is this idea that there's a God, right, according to the Epicureans, a God that is saying you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. Why? Right? Because in many ways, a lot of Epicureans were also skeptics, in the sense of, well, can't see God. And if God is telling me that I can't do this, then I have to ask myself, why? And you'll find that a lot of people wouldn't be able to tell you why, because a lot of people wouldn't understand what was the intent behind some of those moral codes. Now, I have to be honest with you, this is one of the key reasons why so many people feel so uncomfortable with the rules, right, or the dictums of morality that you find sometimes in Christianity, because they seem so insincere in some ways. I'll give you an example. One of the things that really breaks the heart of a lot of people is finding out that Mary Magdalene was never a prostitute you know so why do you teach it? Why do you continue to teach that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute when there is no biblical evidence that she was? You see what I'm saying? How can you be someone who is legitimate, and how can you be someone who is authentic when you do not recognize the fact that, although Christian tradition may teach that Peter was the first whatever, the truth of the matter is that the first human being who saw the resurrected Lord was Mary, not Peter. Right? So it really begins there. It begins there with reclaiming authenticity and not being disingenuous, right? And if in fact you're going to hold people to moral expectations, well, that means also holding yourself to them, and that also means holding power to them. But if you're going to turn your back on people who need you because you want to sustain some type of right political relationship with an oppressor, you're not going to get a lot of people decades from now being all gung-ho for you. Because when they really needed you to be Jesus, you weren't. You were Pilate. You washed your hands, right? So these are some of the top questions that, we're not going to answer tonight. And we're not going to answer in Johnnie Coleman in an hour. But these are tough questions that we have to ask ourselves, yeah? And then finally, the Stoics, man. The Stoics believed that the highest authority, the highest reason, is in nature. The Stoics, in essence, many of them didn't necessarily look to God. You'll find that probably one of the most famous of all Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, was very hostile towards the Christians in persecution. But what they believed is nature, really, and understanding, having respect for the reverence of life, the way that nature accords it. And again, there's discontinuity there, and doesn't make sense, because on the one hand, one of the laws of nature is the preservation of life, but on the other one, differences in opinions for the safety of the empire. You go out there and you conduct a persecution. So again, this is a theory, doesn't always follow through in practice. Very cool. Let's go to the next idea that we want to look at this evening. And this one here is, I think, a very important piece that I think all of you should take some time to take a photograph of, because again, it's going to break down for you the tradition, the Christian tradition, in Western philosophical terms. So everything begins with this idea of ethics, which, as we said, is the idea of moral philosophy. But then what ends up happening is that there's two major schools that break from just looking at moral philosophy in general, and attempt through these two schools to begin to discuss some of the questions of what it means to do the right thing. What does it mean to live the right life? What does it mean to pursue happiness and virtue, so on and so forth? And so the two schools, if you notice over here, the two schools are the deontological and the teleological. If you notice underneath, it says right here where my cursor is going around in circles, you'll notice that it says that the word deontological is derived from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. So it's concerned with doing the right thing. Okay? In other words, with doing the right thing simply because it is the right thing to do. So it isn't about whether you like it. It isn't about whether you agree with it. It's not even so much with what your opinion may be. It's that it's the right thing to do. That's a very controversial one, especially for us nowadays, because we believe that any action that we take is predicated on the rationale for the action that we're going to take. And that makes total sense. But if you look, for instance, at Buddhist thought, right, and I'm just using that as an example, most ideas behind Buddhist thought is right action. But right action does exclude certain behaviors. Right action, for instance, cannot include anything that violates the principle of ahimsa. So if you're doing something that you claim is right action, but you're ignorant of ahimsa, then you're not doing right action. Because ahimsa means that it must be nonviolent. So right action in the Buddhist tradition is not right action liberally, relatively, in terms of relative terms. It's not relativity. You have to do right thing or right action in accordance to a paradigm, which is what? Of ahimsa. The reason why I'm saying that is because people have the tendency that if it's Buddhist, it's all good. But we fail to understand that Buddhism, like any other religion, establishes parameters of action. In the Christian tradition, the deontological principle of right action is predicated on the Sermon on the Mount. You could say the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So no, you can't do whatever it is that you want to do. You have to do that which, number one, according to Jesus and according to the whole Christian tradition, is what? Respecting the God in the other person, because the other person has been created in the image of God like you have. So that automatically tells you, oh, and by the way, when Jesus is asked about the 10 Commandments, he says that if you do unto others as others would have you would have the others do unto you, and that you are in essence, okay, following the Shema, then the whole law and all the prophets hang on those two things. So your understanding of those first few commandments of who God is and the centrality of God in your life, followed by the right action towards your neighbor, loving them as God has loved you and doing unto them as you would have them do unto you. Those are the parameters in order for you to do what? The right thing. So I'm just saying that because it flies in the face of the skeptic, or it flies in the face of moral relativism. And then it's broken down into two things, duty and rights. And the idea there of duty and rights, you could say, has a lot to do with this notion of, it's the rights that are inherited, the unalienable rights that I receive by being a child of God. And then how do those duties reflect those rights? So again, we're not talking now just civil rights. We're talking about human rights, and we're talking about those rights that come to us by what? By default, because we are children of God. So when you look at the deontological ethical school, you're looking at doing the right thing because the right thing is the right thing to do, but you do the right thing because the right thing has been dictated, mandated through this authority, which is God, of which we come from. And so therefore, in doing that, we are doing what God would have us to do, because in the end, we come from God. So it should be a natural outpouring out of us. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The other school is the teleological school. And if you look over here, we said this last week, teleological means that there's an end, or that there's a goal, or that there's a purpose. And so, of course, the example being used here is science, of course. And the reason for that is because remember that there are two ends, right? We said that there are instrumental ends, which are the means, and we have intrinsic ends, which are the ends. And the huge argument back in the day is, do the means justify the ends, or do the ends justify the means, right? And so one teleological perspective is the idea of being good has a lot to do with what? The character and the relationships that we possess. Okay. So you could say that in essence, being good comes with, as we had said before, knowledge. It comes before with doing away with ignorance, with keeping ourselves in a constant what? Reconfiguration, thinking, improving, a growth, a inner transformation, so that our character continues to resemble more and more and more those perfections of virtue, of balance, of moderation, which in the end will what? Reflect in the quality of relationships that we have. Okay. By the way, we cannot guarantee that the other people will be that way towards us. Keep that in mind. So do not think that that example of reciprocity is something that's always going to happen, or for that matter, it's even guaranteed. Although I should say something about that. Albert Bandura was convinced, the great psychologist of the 20th century out of Stanford University in California. He said that there was something called reciprocal determinism, right? And his whole premise there was that if you go into an environment and you manifest a certain type of behavior, you exhibit, I don't mean manifest the way the social media talks about it today, but manifest as in exhibiting a type of behavior that is compassionate and apathetic and full of empathy, and not apathetic, and loving and not indifferent, and caring rather than distant or aloof, that people are going to slowly but surely, or sometimes automatically, respond. And so the entire environment, climate, the whole vibe in that environment is going to change to mirror the one that you bring into that environment. And then, of course, that is going to cause the other people in that community to have their culture changed as well. Now, if you've ever heard of industrial or industrial psychologists, organizational psychologists, they precisely go into businesses that are not doing well, and they work with the managers and the higher level managers to change the culture of the organization. The idea is that if you change the culture, you ensure what? Better productivity, a better work environment, quality of work, quality of environment, quality of life, and the overall environment is going to be what? Essential for this new vibe, or this new DNA that you want to see reflected in all of the people. And as the new workers come, they're going to adopt that new culture rather than the toxic one that came from before. It's the same principle here. And then, of course, the other one is the idea of consequences, right? So the ends in many ways are predicated on whether or not there are consequences. And those consequences are either going to be the result of me doing things because that's how I want to do them, which would be egoism. Now, believe it or not, in the 20th century, one of the biggest American philosophers that promoted egoism was Ayn Rand. She is not necessarily liked. Let me write her name, but it's important that you know her. Let me just stop sharing this for a moment. She was hated by the American left. And the reason for that is because she came from the Soviet Union, from the time of Stalin. And her whole premise was, everything and anything that smells of communitarian or socialist or communist policies, is, especially by those that have never lived in that system, is complete hooey, as it used to be said back in the day. It's completely disingenuous, because her belief was the most important thing that you should do is take that idea of self-interest and take it to its maximum, to the point that she even wrote a book entitled The Virtue of get ready, the virtue of selfishness. And in her view, it's important that you go out there and you generate wealth and you generate independence and you exercise your freedom, because you cannot, nor should you depend on the government, nor you should depend on relationships, nor you should depend on anything or God. So it was very controversial, but that's one expression of egoism. The next one is, of course, utilitarianism, which has, again, its prior, incarnation, if you will, is this idea of the Epicurean perspective. I pursue pleasure and I avoid pain. And the two big names there, of course, are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Stuart Mill is the one who gave us what's called the pleasure-pain calculus, which many people kind of do something like it. Not exactly. It's called the pros and cons list. And the reason why it's not exactly the same is because there's a series of questions that you ask in the pleasure-pain calculus, such as, how long is the pain going to last? So if the pain is very quick, but the pleasure is going to be long-lasting, I'll go with it, like a surgery, right? If the recuperation is a few days, might be painful, but I'm going to be able to walk again or feel great or not have as much back pain, I'll go for it, right? I share with my students that if they tell you, well, guess what? As Valerie was talking at the beginning of class, you're going to have to walk in waist-high snow for 4 years, but you're getting a full ride to Northwestern or DePaul, for instance, and you're going to end up being able to have doors open for you in a great graduate program or career. Guess what? Buy a thick coat, get some snow boots and a good shovel, because guess what? Although it's going to be 4 years of very interesting weather, you're going to have a lifetime of Thanksgiving that you went to that great institution, you made the right contacts and the right people, right? So this is the reason why it's not as simple as it's good or it's bad. It's okay, it may be good now, but it's going to be bad in the long run. It's going to be painful now, but it's going to be better for you in the long run as well. So it all depends on perspectives that are really precise questions that you want to ask. And that's the brilliance behind the pleasure-pain calculus. Very good. So I hope you were able to take a photograph of that. That's important. So now what I want to share with all of you is a way of kind of bringing all this together. As I told all of you, I had been thinking about all of you, and I went and I checked out this great website, and I thought, you know what? This is kind of talking about a lot of the things that we mentioned early on in the course. Now, this is again a blog. I intentionally selected a blog. It's written by an individual such as yourself or me, and it's written on the 5th of February, 2020. Okay, so over a year ago, a year and 17 days. But I'd like to take some time to talk about these 7 points of clarification that the author provides. And again, the reason why I selected it, it's because it's a personal attempt to encapsulate, to write based on their journey in the church, right? As they say, navigating the particular concerns of minorities, so on and so forth, because I serve a minority population. It's perspective, right? But what I think is important is that then they mention a book that they had written, and it was the basis for a very important book, Free at Last. And one of the things that happens here, okay, is that, and I'm not going to tell you who the author is right now, but what this author says is that the genuine gospel that answers these ideologies is the robust and transformative message found in the scripture, along with all of its implications. And the implications are exactly that, the moral consequences. So I had mentioned consequences just a moment ago. So what this author is saying is that it's not just the text, but understanding that the text and enacting the text in my context has implications or consequences, right? Not the anemic or privatized version, right, that emanates from some quarters of contemporary American Christianity, what I tend to call churchianity. This was the basis for a book I wrote decades ago, Free at Last. Now, the one who wrote this is none other than one of the most important Black theologians in the 20th century. His name is Carl Ellis. And I'd like to tell you that Carl Ellis is an individual that is a world-renowned ethicist of the Christian tradition. And in his own story, Carl Ellis goes ahead and says, okay, so I wrote this book. I've been doing ministry among minorities, and this is where I've arrived at. But he also says this, because we've talked about language before, and he says, I have used non-traditional terminology to reach those unfamiliar with traditional theological or biblical terms. This is the reason why I've brought all of the philosophy to all of you, because you might actually get closer talking to people using Plato, using Aristotle, using Hegel, using Marx, using all of these different philosophical themes, using Buddhism, than maybe the types of vocabulary that have lost, right, their reputation or are not trusted by people because they give images of churchianity, right, and not of the authentic Christian story, as Professor Ellis talks about. And there's also another important thing is that, yes, sometimes he does use the biblical narrative, but here's what he says. Language is fluid and co-optable. So what he says is that we have to make sure that we understand that no matter how hard we try, language is always going to be in some way or another potentially misinterpreted. And language has its limitations. I've shared that with you as well. But if you can be clear, and if you yourself can go through this exercise, this is the exercise that I want to share with all of you, okay, which is this idea of making sure that life comes from a very different perspective. Now, he is very controversial, because if you notice, he says, I reject critical theory, right? And so this is going to be controversial probably for some of us. But the reason why he says that is because I am not going to allow political ideology to replace the gospel of Christ. The gospel of Christ is in and of itself radical enough if we really go to that. And that's what this whole idea is. In Christian ethics, the principle is the Christian story was never supposed to be co-opted by government. The Christian story was never supposed to be co-opted by right or left. The Christian story was never supposed to be co-opted by liberation theology or by Black theology or by Hispanic theology or by whites. The narrative of the Christian story was so radical and revolutionary unto itself that just trying to follow the Sermon on the Mount, just trying you or I to follow the Sermon on the Mount is practically impossible. Because there's so many things that we are attached to. There's so many excuses that we give. There's so many explanations for why we choose not to do A, B, or C. And they can be emotional, they can be life experience, they can be upbringing, they can be where we are spiritually. It doesn't matter. But the case of the matter is that, again, it's very controversial. So here's one of the things that he says here. He begins everything by arguing that in his life, his first principle, and I'm going to ask you guys now to do the following for next week. I'm going to go through each one of those categories. You don't have to follow this in terms of the content, but I do want you to follow the category.
Let me ask you a question. I don't mean to interrupt you, Dr. Medina.
No, that's okay.
You're speaking kind of fast here. So most of the stuff that you've spoken about tonight, okay, we should have been taking pictures of it, because
yeah, well, you don't have to, and it helps.
It's the stuff, but everything I do know what you're saying is going to be in Google Classroom. I understand it on Google Drive.
No, I wasn't going to be doing that. I was just going to be sending the links by email.
Oh, I see. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But, sometimes people don't even like to worry about that. It's just like taking a photograph and that's it.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, but I should have been doing it early, but I did take notes. I didn't take the entire picture.
That's all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll send an email. That's okay. It was an interruption. I'm thankful that you brought that up. But what I want all of you to be able to do is I want you to be able to come up with your own 7 points. And they can be however you want to articulate them. The only thing is that they should be rooted in what? Ethics. That's all. Now, I am not going to tell you that it should be 7 categories of whatever these may be, and they have to be staunchly Christian. No, I would never do that. What I would like to see is that you're able to bring in some of that Christian narrative into the conversation, only because that's the course. That's all. And because I believe that we should be able to look at the languages from different religious traditions and see how those languages can do what? Those words can help us. Sometimes we really don't know the origin of words, and by not knowing the origin of words, we may believe that the language is dead, or we may believe that the language doesn't have any real impact in our lives, but it actually does. So this would be another invitation. It's just an invitation for curiosity, an invitation of how comfortable you would feel in developing this personal list of ethical principles that has been in some way influenced perhaps by the course or by other experiences that you've had. In Professor Ellis's view, everything begins with what? With beliefs. And here's where he articulates beliefs. Okay, that's very important. And his beliefs are, regarding my beliefs, I firmly stand with the Bible as the word of God. I believe and teach that it is infallible and inerrant in its original manuscript. So in his particular case, he believes that the original documents are infallible and without error. That's him. Cool. But by the way, that statement is going to definitely what? Influence his ethics. This is an example. This is another reason why I use this. This is an example of when you say, I have a moral compass, and that moral compass is predicated on what? On an authority that is not human, that has always been. Well, this is the example that Professor Ellis uses. Why does he follow ethics the way that he does? Well, because he believes that the word of God, as he refers to the Bible, is what? Literally the word of God in its original manuscript. This is important because I'll give you an example. In the original manuscripts, the word eon in Greek was mistranslated. And so when people talk about eternal damnation, that's wrong. Because the word eon in the original languages, coming out of Hebrew and Aramaic, never meant permanent or indefinite. It meant temporal. So in Judaism, there is no such thing as eternal damnation. So now if you're looking at Jesus, who's Jewish, not Christian, and he's teaching these teachings which eventually become part of the New Testament, the understanding is, which is the reason why he taught what? The prodigal son, because you will come back. Even though you may spend time, right, caring for pigs and eating the husks as a result of certain things in your life that you did, at some point in time, you'll come back. And who's going to be waiting for you? The Father, who's going to give you a ring, because once he's known you, before you were even made into what? Fashioned into a body coming out of your mom, before that even experience ever happened, he already knew you. So what exactly is you being born? It's you leaving your inheritance. Isn't that deep, man? The whole prodigal son is the story of what happens to you, to me, when we're born. We leave the inheritance and we come into this world of a distant country to deal with what it means to be human, as Jesus did, so that at some point in time we what? We are reunited and the joy is made complete. You see, the end is happiness. Now, the question as to why all of this is happening, okay, well, that's a $64,000 question. I've got my own ideas, but not for tonight. Right, so I want you to come up with something that represents your beliefs. There's an example here that he says, he believes that, third, I believe that the word of God and the transformative gospel of Jesus Christ gets to the root of the problem by addressing the disease itself, man's core corruption. So in his belief, he believes humanity, right? He calls mankind, so he's conservative, does what? It corrupts. The man's core is corrupt. So the man in this individual's language is sinful. You may not say that, and that's cool. I don't agree with that, but it's important for you just to see the way that this individual has articulated that, right? The next one is social religions, he entitles it. And of course, one of the things that he talks about is that he believes that the social religions, right, go against his views. And so he's against critical theory. He's against liberation theology. He's against James Cone. Okay? But you could be against him. I am. And you could simply say, hey, look, you know what? I believe that religion has a social role. And I believe that religion needs to be prophetic. And I believe that religion does have to work together with what? With society, with civil society. And it has a responsibility to advocate for the poor and the oppressed. It's not as simple as just saying Jesus loves you. That's not going to resolve everything unless other structural ills are dealt with, right? So that's the second one. The third one is the academy. And what he refers to the academy has to do with, in particular, he is against the way that seminaries have promoted critical critical theory. I studied critical race theory. I studied critical theory in biblical studies. So to me, I am so thankful that I did. He's against it. To be very honest with you, I want you to be able to say what you think are the strengths and the weaknesses of seminaries. And what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of education at the local church? What are the things that you feel that Sunday school or your parish or this seminary should be doing in terms of what? Teaching an ethical reality that is going to call people into action and call people into what? Into transformation. Okay. And you'll have this video again. Obviously, it's being recorded. So you'll be able to watch it and listen to this section and maybe pause and stop me and you can hear what I'm saying. But what's important here is I want you to tell me how and to what extent is the narrative that is being taught and the teaching in general at seminaries, at universities, at the local parish. Is it empowering people? Is it broadening our ethical horizons? Is it limiting us? Is it part of the problem? What do you think? The next one he refers to is our fallen world. Okay, and again, I'm going to give you the link for this. And if you see that he is against just about anything that promotes dehumanization. Now, one of the things that I do feel is important about this is that he may say things that I'm not totally 100% behind him in terms of the Bible, this or that. But what he is willing to say here in this section is that it doesn't matter if something's to the right or something's to the left. If it dehumanizes and it hurts people, it's wrong, right? One of the reasons why, if you look at the last 50 years in the United States, one of the reasons why there was so much intense debate against the right or the left was because there always seemed to be an inconsistency in the 70s and in the 80s, certainly in the 60s, but in the 70s and the 80s. You started seeing it change a little bit in the 90s, but even in the 90s, where you would have Democrats, for instance, that would say that what was going on in Chile with Augusto Pinochet, who was fascist, right wing, was completely wrong. And Amnesty International would get involved and human rights violations were submitted, right? But they never did that for Fidel Castro, who was left wing, but he was doing the same thing as Pinochet was doing. That lost a lot of credibility. And the reason why that lost a lot of credibility is because there wasn't any consistency. If you're going to be against evil, be against all forms of evil. That was another problem with the Pope. The Pope was totally behind the Poles. He's Polish, right? The Pope, Pope John Paul II, was 100% behind the Solidarity movement in Poland. And he pulled every string he could as Pope to get the Soviet Union to back off the workers in solidarity in Poland. But he didn't do that for people in the Middle East. He didn't do that for people who were in Latin America at that time suffering communism, like the Nicaraguans under Daniel Ortega, right? And of course, in Cuba. Never happened. So the concern here was, how do you keep consistency? If something is wrong, it's wrong. Whether to the right or to the left, it's wrong. And that's what he's trying to say here. See what I'm saying? So for instance, you can't say that terrorism is bad outside of the United States, and you're going to put all your resources to make sure somebody's not with Al-Qaeda or with ISIS, but you're not going to pay attention to the Ku Klux Klan. That's just hypocritical. You get me? So anything that dehumanizes people to the right or to the left needs to be discussed. And that's one of the key points here, right? The next one, of course, is the issue of language. And that's important because it may be that it's something for you that's not important, but I would ask you to think about that. Think about language and think about how language has been something that has impeded ethics, how language has not been helpful, or how has language challenged the ability to practice. I'll give you an example. There are some people that say that Christian ethics sounds, right, too white, or that Christian ethics sounds too Republican, or that Christian ethics sounds too conservative, or it sounds too Marxist, it sounds too communist. You'd be surprised, or it sounds too misogynist, anti-women, or it sounds too masculine, right? All of these are criticisms that at some point in time have been true. But the reason why I think language is also important is because after the 20th century, from the late 19th century, and certainly after the Second World War, I cannot tell you how much was written in philosophy about language. The French school, in particular, the French school of the 20th century after the war, spent so much of its time, and I totally agree with this. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love the French school, deconstructing language. So what do words actually mean? I think that's important. What do words actually mean? I'll give you an example. Today on NPR, they were making, it was an incredible story about the daughters of Dr. King and of Malcolm X sitting down together and talking about their father's legacy. And some information came out of that conversation that a lot of people did not know. Fascinating material. But today, right, outside of Black America, you've got non-Black Americans, Hispanics, whites, so on and so forth, using the N-word. Now, ethically, what does that mean? Should they? Is it offensive? Has that changed? Is it no longer offensive? Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it relative or is it absolute? Because I can guarantee you that James Baldwin, Nina Simone, etc., would never have fathomed that that would be acceptable. Especially James Baldwin, right? And so there's an incredible interview with James Baldwin at the Dick Cavett show. Any of you ever watch it, you go on YouTube, just put James Baldwin, Dick Cavett. And there's a part that a very young Dick Cavett is asking James Baldwin about the American story for African Americans, for Black Americans. And James Baldwin is smiling half of the time because he's like, in a way, almost like it's disbelief that the topics that are being asked. But he's very sympathetic and he's very helpful in kind of walking this young journalist through. But at the end of the day, he's somewhat pessimistic about the outcomes. So does language play a role? Can language be violent? Can language cause us to be apathetic? Can language cause us to forget? Can language cause us to minimize the impact historically of struggle? And has language caused us, because now Christianity in the United States, we now technically live in a post-Christian society. So what does that mean? Do words like lamb, blood of the lamb, the cross, Holy Spirit, even these words have changed. They no longer perhaps have the same impact. So from a theological point of view, can we present the message of God, but through different language? Right? Language is a commodity nowadays. So to what extent is that also something that we need to think about, right? Another and final 2 points, of course, is, do we believe, it says here, differentiating disciplines. In his case, he is concerned with interdisciplinary perspectives. He thinks psychology should be psychology. Sociology should be sociology. But they shouldn't be considered disciplines that have anything to do with theology. The point here, though, is that even an accurate statement? Are we to do theology in a vacuum? Is that what he's suggesting? What do you think? Is the local church, and what I shared with all of you at the beginning of the class is that the local church is where theology should be done. So that means that the people in the local church, they don't have theology degrees. You know, in fact, by you doing theology in the local church, you're actually taking it away from the seminaries that have made theology what? Almost an elitist practice, right? That's something that Socrates hated, because Socrates wanted philosophy to be done on the streets, because he thought that no matter how much philosophy you talked about, if you didn't put philosophy into practice, what's the point of talking about it? Well, you can kind of say the same thing about theology, can't you? If at the end of the day, theology is just going to stay within the seminary, but it's never going to be talked about. It's never going to be discussed. It's never going to be anything that's going to go out of that, place where we talk about theology or where we talk about God. And it's just going to be kept at the level of, the academy. So what's the point? Is it important to look at theology as part of everything else? Is it important to look at history theologically? Is it important to look at politics theologically? Is it important for us to see in sociology something that we can learn about theology? Is anthropology something that we could then learn to do theology better? And finally, looking ahead. He ends by saying, what matters most at this point in my life is loyalty to Christ. Well, that's his conclusion. What's yours? How do you look at your ethics from where you were before this class started to now? What are some of the key challenges, or what are some of the things that you really believe need to happen in your local parish, within you, within the sphere of influence and power that you have? What about power? Well, to what extent does power and ethics play a role? To what extent has the journey that you've had in the world of religion and spirituality influenced you, guided you, troubled you, informed you, that you arrive at the conclusions now? And what are some of the key things that you look into the future that you really believe that the church needs to address in whatever way that you think it needs to be? Okay, so these are the 7 things that I want you to put together throughout the week. Put it together. And maybe you can have the first 3 ready by next week, and then you can finish the other 4 for the following, right? And then in 2 weeks' time, not this upcoming Monday, the next one, in 2 weeks' time, it'll be due. Okay, so 2 weeks from today, it'll be due. And the good thing about it is that it gives you an opportunity to explore and to think about that. Okay. And again, you'll have this video that you can watch it, and I'll talk more about it next week. But I really think that what's important is that you come out of this class with your own ethical foundations, that you can pretty much tell a person, look, these are my 7 principles. This is how I see my ministry. This is how I see my life. This is how I understand God. This is how I understand what I'm supposed to do on this planet. This is how I understand why people aren't doing it. These are the major challenges. These are the major concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Make sense? All right. So now let's go to the next section. Oh, there's a chat. Forgive me. No. Shakila, thank you for asking that. In 2 weeks. Go ahead, Porter.
Unmute yourself, Porter.
Thank you. There was a brief interruption in the transmission, so I only kind of got part of what you said. I did get the 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Part of it, and the the preparation of or coming out with a foundational sort of ethical, footprint.
Yeah.
As kind of the goal, but I just want to make sure that I didn't miss anything
Sure.
else.
No, not a problem.
Yeah.
What you want to
Okay.
do, the goal really of the assignment is that you're able to leave the course, I should say, having developed 7 core ethical principles that define in essence the way you see the role of ethical practice and life for your ministry, for your faith, and to engage the world. And the reason why those 7 points are important is because they expand on just not the way that one sees God, but the institution itself. How does the church contribute or not contribute? How do seminaries help or do not help, right?
Mhm.
How even the language that we use, how is that in some way?
Right. Okay.
Right. And I think that the reason for why that's important for us, and I'm just kind of taking this a step further from the question that you asked, Porter, is because I haven't forgotten, which meant a lot to me, what were some of the concerns that Shakila shared at the beginning of the course. And I really believe that for me, the reason why that resonated with me is because I've always had that concern, right? I'll give you an example of why I think that what she said was so important. Yesterday morning, I preached. I do every Sunday at a local UCC church. And when the sermon was done and when I gave the benediction and the service was over, I'm walking out and a lady that's there, she tells me, Daniel, and I don't have a problem with or without titles or anything like that. That's cool. That's not a problem. She tells me, Daniel, and there's a new member right in front, not even a new member, a visitor right in front. And she tells me, oh, you forgot the Lord's Prayer. And I'm thinking, now let me see if I understand this. I got here before time. I set up this entire cybernetic system so that people who are at home or abroad or can't come to the parish because of COVID are able to be part of this community. I prepare the bulletin way in advance. I provide a sound, theological, challenging, and progressive view of Scripture. Every time I'm always talking about 4 different passages of Scripture using original language. I even mentioned the Lord's Prayer in the sermon. And because we actually didn't say, Our Father who art in heaven, the entire experience was limited to that, Danny, you forgot the Lord's Prayer. That means to me, I just smiled because I was like, knowing me, I always forget something, and I do. I'm the absent-minded professor. But it was so sad to know that what that woman took was nothing that is going to be transcendental at all in her life, except one criticism. That for being a Congregationalist, I find funny, because Roman Catholics are the ones that you have to say the same thing every single Sunday. For Congregationalists of the progressive swing, I could have said a poem from Rumi and it would have been fine. So what are you doing with what's being taught? And this is what I remember Shakila had said. What are you doing with what's being taught? What are you doing with the ethics that you are learning? And I think that at the end of the day, that's what's important. And this is something that I struggle with all my life. Why are we in such a bad state? And to be honest with you, this is the reason why we had the January 6th insurrection, because most of these churches replaced Jesus with the Republican Party. They replaced love for, elitism, and they replaced compassion for fear. And that is what you get, where you have a cult. It's become a cult. So no Sermon on the Mount, forget that. All of those teachings are gone. And that's the reason why I believe language is so important, because you would think that if you'd hear blessed are the poor, right? That doesn't mean anything today. It doesn't mean anything today. You've got these people going down to Mar-a-Lago here in the state of Florida to consult with Trump. Never has that ever happened when a president has left office, except now. That's a cult of personality. And that is completely un-American, but it's also what? It's a fearful thing, because these people believe themselves to be God-fearing people. So yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Very, very powerful, very important. Thank you, Porter, for asking that.
Mhm. Sure.
And again, we'll have this recording available to all of you, and we'll talk more about it
Okay.
next week.
All right.
The one final thing I want to share with all of you, which I think is very important, I wanted to make sure that all of you can, and I'm gonna send this to all of you as well, but I still think it's important. There's a website that I found that gives you, because most seminaries don't do this, and it really upsets me. But I came up with this wonderful section of looking at the 25 Black theologians who are unfortunately unknown in most seminaries, and that just really, really bothers me. But these are names, and this is the only reason I'm connecting it, because they really don't talk about their theology, but it has women and it has men. And I invite you to, on your spare time, as you develop your ministry, as you develop your, as I like to say as a jazz musician, you develop your chops as a minister, right? And as you have an opportunity to do some reading, maybe when you're not in class, maybe when there's a summer break or you got some downtime, pick up one of these books, check them out. Look at what they have to say. You don't have to agree with it. But the reason why it's important is because, unfortunately, most seminaries only focus on white theologians, or maybe the James Cones, or and there's a lot of everyday work that's being done that's just kind of put off to the margins, and it shouldn't be that way. Like, for instance, in the case of Brian Bantam, he's talking about a hybrid sense of Christianity. It's a fascinating idea. And so, and again, you may not be 100% on board with all of them, but that's also part of it. Where do you find these ideas that are weak? Where do you find these ideas that are pretty hip? That's what's important. Okay. And some of them you're going to find are like, oh my gosh, some of these people are pretty conservative and some are not. Like, so for instance, Kelly Brown Douglas, the total opposite of Ellis, right? The total opposite of Ellis. This, Douglas writes a book, The Black Christ, which, to be honest with you, is a fantastic book. It's a fantastic book, but it's a challenging book, but it's a book that you really need to check out. Okay. Burton's The Blessing of Africa, the Bible and African Christianity. You'll probably never see a seminary that talks about that. That's an important book to also check out. Carl Ellis, Karen Ellis, these, again, more conservative. But what's interesting is that at Howard University, you have the original African Heritage Study Bible. That is an interesting tool, because the hermeneutics, as it says down there, helps you to look at a lot of vocabulary. Go back to what we just talked about with language, right? How much has the language been lost? And by the way, how much has the language been turned white? You know what I'm saying? You ever thought about that? How language also helps to promote one race over the other, right? That's big. That's really big. Because in the East, when you enter into a space of peace, it's black. Even the Japanese talk about in Zazen, when you enter a state of full meditation in Zazen, when you're totally disconnected and you feel absolute total peace, you know what they call that? You enter nothingness, and nothingness is black. But you don't feel fear. You feel total peace. Isn't that kind of counterintuitive to a white culture? Of course it is. But did that have anything to do with language? You better believe it. Okay, so that's an interesting text. And of course, I also think that the work by Hamer is important, because it's a challenging view of looking at her past and how she ultimately engages Christianity. It's a very interesting story, and it's a very important one. Okay, And it brings what I think is important: theology, politics, society, social development, the underprivileged. It's just a really important concept, especially for today's day and age. And one of the most, I think, important things here is Matthew's book as well, honoring the ancestors. And to what extent do you look at, to what extent doing Christianity, how does it not have to be a divorcing of heritage, but rather the Bible itself celebrates heritage, which isn't forgotten. It's like Jesus goes where? Jesus goes to Africa. He goes to Egypt, right? When he's a kid. And then he comes back out of Egypt into the Middle East. But you never hear a preacher say, so Jesus went to Africa, right? You'll hear a preacher say, well, Jesus went to Egypt, and focuses on the mosaic. But to be honest with you, when Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are in Egypt, they're not really looking at Moses. In fact, one of the most prosperous Jewish communities was in Egypt, right? So where is that in Bible study? You get me? Which is, I think, another reason why this is important. I just really wanted to share it with all of you, because does that influence our ethics? Of course it does, man. And because it totally changes what? Our narrative. And that's important. Right.
Dr. Medina,
Yes.
actually, what is really great about this seminary is that we're now touching on those things, like through you and through Professor Tanisha Rowan and through
Yeah.
Will Coleman.
Yeah.
Those are the things that we're touching on now. A lot of things that we may not have known or didn't even think about doing. That's what we're doing now. And I just thank each of you that have come forward and, that are teaching in the seminary right now.
Oh, it's an honor. Thank you. It's an honor. Evelyn, I love every minute that I'm with all of you. And I love Dr. Price immensely. And to me, it is a joy. And I will never forget how, in many ways, this kind of started for me as having a wonderful conversation with Mary Tumpkin when we were students sitting in the same table. We were sitting at the same table at a doctoral seminar, excuse me, at the seminary in downtown Miami. And just, being amazed by her vision that she had acquired from Johnnie Coleman. And, and not to be doing this, to me, it's in many ways coming full circle. But to me, it's honoring Mary's memory. It's obviously honoring Johnnie's memory. These titans, titan spiritual leaders. And it's the least that I can do. And it's an honor, man. It's an honor because truth has to be said. And this is our job. Our job is to break the cycle, break the cycle. So in any way that we can do it, that's important. So thank you. Thank you for those words of encouragement. I really appreciate that. Willie James Jennings, man, I remember reading this material some time ago, and I was like, wow, that's fascinating. This book here, The Christian Imagination, I think Jennings is one of the reasons why I always talk about imagination. I think it's Dr. Jennings and Nick Cave. So a theologian and a punk musician, but I think both of them have talked about the divine imagination. And I love that, because to me, the divine imagination is what helps me to conceive of a world of justice. And we go back to this principle of everyone doesn't just deserve it, but everyone demands it by the sheer nature of having been born. I want you to keep that in mind. Ethically speaking, the principle is that if you are born by nature of being born, okay, by nature of being born, you demand justice, right? And it's not something that you have to beg for, and it's not something that you should ask for. It's mandated. And that, to me, is what the imagination does. The imagination contemplates of a society where that's the principle, the expectation, not the exception. But how does that inform my ethical practice? And I think that, to me, it does, because imagination is what helps me to conceive not just of how the world can be, but it helps me to understand how I need to be, because I can imagine it. And it helps me to also understand how, through language and through ritual and through song and through rhythm and through community, I access God and God accesses me. Because that's important. I just don't access God, God accesses me, because I am this conduit, right? So that spirit works. And so I need to be aware of the fact that I'm an instrument. Um, and I think that this idea where Jennings talks about theology, the birth of theology and the origin of race is like fascinating. Because when you really look at the Bible is a very black book. Very key people are African, they're black. But when you get into the world that we know in the 19th century, it isn't. It's all white, man. And even if you watch something like the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, they're all white, man. Right? So you got to step back and ask yourself, so what the hell happened? What happened is that, the imagination is a beautiful thing that we all possess, but the imagination can be manipulated as well, because language is what gives life to the imagination. The imagination has to have a way to express itself, and it's through language, through vibration, through sound. And this is one of the reasons why I think Sun Ra was so big about his Afrofuturism, because he made this huge point about the fact that words and vibrations, if you're in an environment where the sound and the music is not helping you to be edified, then forget it. Forget it. You have no chance. And that's the reason why the language that we choose to use is so important. And in the Bible, it always tells you, be careful with what you say, because you'll bring it into reality, right? And so words are powerful, but we've converted words into a commodity where they just transmit ideas, but they don't transmit truth. They don't transmit life. But just because we don't think they do, they still do. So it's the reclaiming of that. And that comes from a heritage that you find in Mother Africa. You find that comes from Mesopotamia. It comes from ancient Eastern African traditions. It does not come from the industrialized West, man. But unfortunately, that's what's happened. Even the Greek stuff that I shared with all of you, they're as Western as any one of us is Russian. But what happened is that the history books distorted the whole thing and made Greeks Westerners. What? So when we understand language and we understand what's being manipulated behind language, we'll have a better understanding of how we need to act. And that's at the end of the day what ethics is. The marriage between what I say and what I do, bringing it together for the honor of God through you and I, who really represent what? The face of God. And that's the whole principle behind it. All right. I hope all of you are well. Thank you so much for this wonderful class. I will send you these links. The recording will be ready as well, probably by tonight, if not first thing by mañana, tomorrow. And I'll make sure that you guys get the recording as well. And I will send the links with the recordings, and then that way you can have everything in just one little email and you'll be good to go. So by tomorrow, I'll do that. I also want you to know that I thank you so much for the opportunity and, and the privilege of being able to talk to you about all this stuff. You have no idea how much joy it brings to me and how I feel that I'm being used for the purposes for which I was created. So it's a very, very, very wonderful feeling. So thank you to all. God bless you all. Please be safe and know of my prayers for all of you, your families, your loved ones, your parishes. Peace be with all of you, okay? Namaste, and be good, and my love to all of you, okay? Take care.
Good
Peace.
God
night.
bless.
God
Good night
bless.
and God bless you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.